Hey, I'm socially impaired, and recently the BBC put out a video about memes and gifs and how they relate to cultural appropriation. So, let's check that out.
Ever shared this? Or this? Nothing like a good reaction gif, right? But you've probably noticed the most popular ones are of black people being dramatic. This is digital blackface. Blackface is when a non-black person uses makeup to blacken up. Minstrel shows depicted black people in all sorts of negative ways. They were mocking, demeaning stereotypes, and they exaggerated black people's facial features and their expressions.
Yes, I very much agree that when a non-black person dresses up as a bunch of black stereotypes and then portrays themselves as fools, losers, and jackasses, all in the effort to demonize an entire race of people, then yes, that's pretty fucking racist. And I'm very glad that we don't do that anymore. I'm also glad that we don't downplay these events by comparing them to things that have nothing to do with racism.
And digital blackface is the 21st century version of that. White people using gifs to perform some kind of exaggerated blackness.
No, 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 no.
And that's not all. Let's talk about white people using dark-skinned emojis.
Yes, let's talk about white people using dark-skinned emojis. Let's not talk about dark-skinned people using white emojis. Let's not talk about Hispanic people using Asian emojis. And let's definitely not talk about, if you actually cared about the principle of the matter, which is one race using the emoji of another race, which I also don't care about. So let's not talk about the principle of the matter, but let's talk specifically about white people using dark-skinned emojis.
This is a form of cultural appropriation, paying little respect to someone else's culture and using it however you please.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
You are conflating racism and culture as if they are the same thing. Figure out the difference between the two before you make a video about it, you idiot.
So what's wrong with white people posting these gifs and using these emojis?
Yes, why is it wrong when white people do this? And that's the key here. White people. Not black people or brown people, not Asian people or Hispanic people, not any other race, but white people and only white people. So yes, please tell me why it's wrong for white people and only white people to use these types of gifs and emojis.
Well, black people are not here for other people's entertainment.
The examples you gave at the beginning of this video was of entertainers who were engaged in entertaining other people. That was the whole reason why they were doing what they were doing, to entertain people. I mean, yes, the gifts that you personally handpicked were of black people, and the reason that you did that was to fit your narrative. But there are just as many, if not much more gifts out there that are not of African descent.
We're not symbols of excessive emotion, and we aren't here to make you look more sassy, more sexy, or more street. We don't want to be seen as having two-dimensional personalities. Let us decide for ourselves how we wish to be perceived.
Why the fuck do you have to base everything on race and the differences in groups of people? Why can't you just judge people based on their own individual merits? For instance, you are a moron. You're a fucking moron. And kind of a racist. But you know what? Unlike you, I don't just look at your skin tone and then say, well, this individual is a fucking moron. Therefore, every single person who shares her skin tone must also be a moron. I'm going to lump her entire race in. She's a fucking idiot, so they all must be. No, I'm not going to do that. And I ask that you don't do that either.
Now, I'm not saying you have to be black to post these gifs.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I am so grateful to know that you're not trying to pass any rules or laws preventing an entire race of people from using a specific kind of gift or emoji. Thank you so fucking much for your understanding. I really appreciate it.
But what I am saying is think about what you're doing. Ask yourself why you're always drawn to that gif or that emoji.
Sure. Yeah, okay. I'll go ahead and do that. And while I'm doing that, I would like you to think about what you're doing. Ask yourself, why do you feel the need to handpick gifs of black entertainers even though they don't make up the majority of popular gifs? Ask yourself, why is it that you're constantly focusing on different races and groups of people when you could instead focus on the acts of the individuals? Ask yourself, why is it that you were given a platform on the BBC to talk to large audiences on a topic that you know virtually nothing about?
So that's my view. But what do you think?
What do I think? You want to know what I think? Well, I think, just for starters, that you don't even understand the difference between race and culture. You see, race is biological and expresses itself through things like skin pigmentation, facial features, hair color, and other things of that physical nature. Culture, on the other hand, has to do with our behavior and attitudes, the way that we present ourselves and socialize with one another. Now, of course, these things are more complex than I'm making them out to be, but I'm just trying to break these things down to their most simplistic versions. That way, even your simple two-dimensional mind can still understand it. Okay, so if you have a group of people living on their own for a substantial sum of time, then certain physical traits are going to start to prop up and become more dominant, distinguishing themselves from other groups of people who do not live amongst them. Now, of course, marginalized groups will inevitably develop their own culture within that group. So, in a lot of cases, race and culture can go hand in hand. But that doesn't mean that they're the same thing at all. For instance, if you adopt a baby, then it won't matter what race that baby is. It will still grow up in the culture that is presented to it. Now, granted, on rare occasions, some people do outright reject the culture that they are born into, and seeing how shitty a lot of cultures are, I don't really see anything wrong with that. The fact of the matter is that a child will most likely adopt the characteristics associated with the culture that they grew up in. Which leads me to ask you this. If you adopted a white child, and your white child grew up in a culture where dreadlocks were very popular, and after years and years of growing up and living in this very specific culture, decided to grow out dreadlocks of their own, would you then put a stop to it and say, no, you can't do that because you're culturally appropriating that style of hair? But that's the thing, they're clearly not culturally appropriating that style because they grew up in that culture. They are part of that culture regardless of their race. And the reason that I give this example is because you did not say, hey, if you're not a member of this culture, you shouldn't do this because it's cultural appropriation. You said, hey, white people shouldn't do this, because they're white. So I ask you, please stop confusing culture and race. Now, when it comes to adopting, well, I was just using that as an extreme example to show how idiotic your point was. But you don't have to grow up in a culture to adopt certain aspects of that culture. Because that's the thing about culture. It's a behavior. It's how you act and feel, and how you express yourself and whatnot. So if you see a certain style or look on someone, and you like it to the extent that you wish to recreate it on yourself, then you can easily adopt those aspects of that culture. I mean, have you ever heard the saying, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery? Look, there's a big difference between adopting a certain aspects of a culture because of how much you like it yourself versus dressing up in blackface in order to mock an entire race of people. And out of all the examples that you could have used to describe some version of modern day blackface, you decided to go with emojis, gifs, and dreadlocks. That's right, dreadlocks. That was one of your examples that you used. What, did you think I wouldn't notice? I mean, what, did you personally invent dreadlocks and are now frustrated with the infringement? No, you didn't. So why are you so pissed off about white people styling their hair in this manner? Oh, okay, so what? Did people with that specific skin tone, are they the ones who created this style of hair? Well, I'm sorry to say, but dreadlocks have existed in all sorts of different races for thousands of years. I mean, have you never heard of ancient Egypt before? And I'm not even going to bother asking about your culture inventing it, because obviously dreadlocks existed far, far longer than the culture that you're personally a part of. But you know what? Just for the sake of argument, let's say that your race was the one race that created this style of hair, known as the dreadlocks. Well, then my question would be, so? And? Really, if this shit matters, then why stop at race? Because the way I look at it is, here's a thing that the human race created, giving me the opportunity to participate in it. Now, granted, I would never wear dreadlocks, nor would I ever encourage anyone to do this, seeing how terrible I think it looks on a person's head, but I'm completely open to anyone and everyone expressing themselves as they see fit, regardless of which race they just so happen to belong to. Of course, I'm also not above calling someone out when they present themselves in a very idiotic way, but I'm still completely open to them doing it. But I'm actually getting off topic, so to follow through with your logic, you don't like other races, or at least specifically the white race, wearing dreadlocks because you believe that your race personally invented it, and if other races, if the white race were to wear this style of hair, then you would consider that cultural appropriation. Okay, so does that mean that any invention or style created by every race that is not your own is something that you do not participate in or use to your benefit at all, ever? Otherwise, you would consider it cultural appropriation? No, of course that's not the case. I mean, I should point out the fact that you're standing in front of a camera. You had this video uploaded to the internet. But you know what? I don't even need to go that far, because the truth is right in the pudding. Just look at your hairstyle. Straight, smooth, silky. You think that style of hair is a part of your race? I think not. So on your own logic, aren't you culturally appropriating someone else's style of hair? Look, if you think wearing your hair smooth and silky is better than dreadlocks or, say, an afro or something, then wear your hair that way. Wear your hair any way you want. But by your own logic, you are culturally appropriating someone else's hairstyle. And while I couldn't give a shit or even agree to that terminology, you, on the other hand, very much care about this. So please practice what you preach. Otherwise, you come off as a giant fucking hypocrite who should not be taken seriously. Look, all I'm saying is if you're going to make a really stupid argument about a non-issue that only divides us based on race, then maybe try not wearing hypocrisy right on the top of your head. Look, just because different races exist does not mean that we have to treat each other differently based on that race. And that is the real, fundamental difference between you and I. You focus on race to the point that you see racism everywhere. You see racism in hairstyles, in emojis, in gifs, and you use these things to divide us based on our race, all while confusing it for culture. You are driven by race to the point of insanity. And I understand that you mean well, but good intentions does not erase the real, actual racism that you are personally presenting to the world. So I ask, regardless of how well-intended your intentions are, if your actions lead you to divide us based on our race alone, regardless of context, that you ask yourself, am I really smart enough to be doing this if the end result divides us based on race alone? Oh, and I threw in context because on rare exceptions, what the context is in regards to race can actually make a real difference. And what I mean by that is, well, okay, as an example, if they made the Marvel Black Panther some white guy from Australia, then yeah, I'd be kind of pissed off about that, because that's not how the character was written. He, as a character, is of African descent from the country of Wakanda, and I would ask that they respect the source material when depicting these characters. Otherwise, they're not actually depicting them. So context does matter. But you are grasping at straws here. You are trying to make virtually anything and everything about race because of how much you view the world through a racist lens. Now, I mean, hey, correct me if I'm wrong, but I very much feel that you would not have made this video, especially in this way, if racism did not play a real role in who you are as a person. Well, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what other people think about this, but that's it for now, so I'll see you next time.